One of the funny things about Christianity is that you have to believe in the supernatural world, at least a little bit, right? Because there's God, and then Jesus comes and he dies and rises again. And so there's at least one miracle at the heart of Christianity, if you don't even want to accept any of the other ones. But like, you have to accept at least one, and there's at least one supernatural being in that God exists, right? And at the same time, as moderns in the Western world, it's really easy to also want to discredit a lot of the supernatural. To be like, that doesn't really exist, that doesn't really happen. And so, for instance, just this last week, one of my friends was going in for surgery because she had cancer on her nose. And it was deep, and there was a lot of it. And so they're like, okay, we're going to go in there, we're going to scrape it off, we're going to have to do this a bunch of times, we might have to do like a skin graft, all that kind of stuff. So when I saw her yesterday at church, and there's nothing going on with her nose, I was like, didn't you have your surgery this week? Like, where's the Band-Aid? Like what happened? And she's like, oh yeah, that was weird. I went in, and they did one pass, and they're like, yep, you're done. What? And she's like, yeah, it was gone. God healed me. She said, I fully expected God to walk me through this, for this to be a thing where I was going to have to trust him and do this. I did not expect him to heal me. And he did. And that is crazy, right? Like, that's wild, right? And yes, okay, we have all these explanations, and we can make these, and we can rationalize it, we can do stuff. But like, God healed her of skin cancer on her nose. Like that's pretty amazing. But even there, like, okay, so God can do stuff. Of course God can do stuff. He's God, right? We believe in this. We're Christians. We're good with this. But what I was not good with for a long time was this idea that there are, like, other gods, right? Like, of course there's not other gods. I was teaching a Sunday school class not that long ago, and I was going through a passage, and one of my students stopped me and was like, hang on, but, like, these aren't really gods, though, right? Like, there's just God. There aren't other gods out there. I was like, well, actually, the Jewish thinkers and writers absolutely believed that there were other gods out there. And so, because of this, I'm no longer a modern monotheist. So, like, if you just go back, just an example, Exodus 15, right? Verse 11, who is like you, Yahweh, among the gods? And as a modern Christian reader, I think, oh yes, those gods, those idols, right? Those things that are not really gods. And there's a few passages that seem to indicate that, especially with my reading, right? Like, oh, of course they're not real. They aren't other gods, right? And definitely they're lowercase anyway. So like, okay, sure, the demonic world exists, but like they're just tricking, and they're just weird like that. And this is where I really appreciate the work of Dr. Michael Heiser on Supernatural, or his larger book, The Unseen Realm, where he really points out, and I think convincingly so, that there are other gods. But that gets weird, right? Because there is only one God. So what's going on with this? And this is where the idea of the divine council, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, all this, like, you can go down the rabbit hole with this one. So let me try and summarize it as briefly as I can, as I understand it so far. Basically, you have God, and he is the only one like him. He exists. He's the only one. There's only one God. Monotheism. But there are also all these other gods, and the word gods here is Elohim, and Elohim is used for God, but it's also used for any kind of supernatural spiritual being, anything that's not in the terrestrial plane, anything that's not, human or animal or something like that. Like, there's this other supernatural aspect of the world. And the Elohim exist in that space, right? Because that is the supernatural world. And so because the supernatural world exists, there are other beings that are doing things in it. And in the case of Scripture, especially Deuteronomy 32, which this is a wild thing, you need to go spend some time researching and reading versions and all this kind of stuff. But God puts other supernatural beings in charge of these other nations and allows them to run the show, which then ultimately ends up being bad. That's not good for them or for the people under them. And so things get bad, and ultimately God's plan of redemption undoes all of that, ultimately leading to Jesus Christ coming and saying, no, you guys don't have to go to those other gods anymore. You don't have to be under those supernatural beings any longer. You can come into my kingdom whenever you like. Come on, let's go. And so, while I am absolutely still a monotheist, a biblical monotheist, I'll call it, so I believe that there is only one God. But there are also other gods, right? So, Yahweh is fully unique. Who is like you? No one. There's nothing else in the supernatural world comes close to who God is. Yahweh is unique, distinct, wholly separate, and completely, amazingly different from all the other supernatural beings. But the other supernatural beings do exist. And so we use the word gods, lowercase, for them. I don't know. I just think it's interesting, right? Because we get so hung up on the supernatural world and all the stuff that's associated with it that it gets weird to talk about this kind of stuff. So have you heard of this before? Have you heard about these other gods? If you've watched anything from the Bible Project, you've probably already seen them. I'll link to a great video down below, or an entire series on the gods, and the supernatural world, the divine council, and all that stuff. It's really good, and it's a good start in starting to think through all of this. How do you view monotheism? How have you looked at all of this? Is this something new? And share your thoughts below, because this is the Bloggy. Let's learn more together.